Please be seated. The Board of Inquiry into the Hazelwood mine fire is now in session.
Before I call Ms Burke, there's a change of appearance for the Council.
If the Board pleases, my name is Slattery and I'll be appearing with Mr McQualter on behalf of the Macquarie City Council during sessions in which representatives of the Council will be evidence.
Thank you, Mr Slattery.
Ms Brooke Burke is a community witness for this afternoon. I call Ms Burke.
Please state your full name.
Brooke Kimberly Burke.
Please raise the Bible and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
to this Board of Inquiry
to this Board of Inquiry
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Good afternoon, Ms Burke. Could you please state again your full name and your address?
Brooke Kimberly Burke.
You've made a statement to the inquiry. You have a copy of it there in front of you. It's a statement of 59 paragraphs and with some photographs attached. Have you reread it recently? Are there any corrections you would like to make? Is it true and correct?
Yes.
I tend to that.
Yes, it'll be Exhibit 54.
Thank you, Your Honour. A little bit about yourself first, Ms Burke. You live in Tarwin Street, Morwell, and you've lived in Morwell all your life. And you live with your husband and two small children?
Yes.
How old are your children?
I've got a 3-year-old and my baby's 11 weeks old.
And you also work in Morwell. You have a business in Driffield Street.
Yep.
And tell us about the business.
I have a dance school in Driffield Road in Morwell. There's approximately 150 students at the school, and I run the business in a partnership with another dance teacher.
And you are also a qualified primary teacher, currently on family leave, I gather.
I'm on family leave from an ongoing teaching position in Newborough. However, I've been doing casual relief teaching around Gippsland, but mainly at Commercial Road Primary School in Morwell, where majority of last year I taught 1 day a week in a prep classroom.
Now, just for the benefit of those of us who are still becoming familiar with Morwell geography, can you point out Driffield Road where the dance school is and also Tarwin Street on the map? There's a ruler there just next to you. Might help extend your reach a bit.
Yeah.
So just one street over from Hazelwood Road where we are now.
Yeah. And we are approximately on the corner of Wallace and Tarwin, about 3 houses down. And my business is Driffield Road, and it's in the middle of Driffield Road.
So right on the western edge of Morwell. On the 9th of February this year, you were out of Morwell that afternoon in Warrigal, I understand, and your children were here in Morwell with your parents.
Yeah, my son
your son. Your daughter
with
wasn't
my mum,
yet with us.
Yeah.
Because you were pregnant at that time,
Yeah.
were you not?
Yeah.
And when was your baby due?
My baby was due the 5th of April.
Okay. Now, during that afternoon, you became aware that there was a fire in the area. How did you find out?
We were looking at homes, builders to build our new home, as we have a block in Morwell. And my mum rang and said she was worried that we wouldn't be able to get back into Morwell because there was a large fire happening and that they'd closed off the freeway. And we were trying to investigate ways of how to get home, whether that be through Ballara or through Driffield or some other way to get back from Warrigal. But we were in Warrigal for quite a long time before we decided to take other treks home.
You were able to find out through Facebook where the fire was located, and you became aware that your studio was right in the area of town that might be affected. What did you do about the studio?
I had quite a few parents ring me and tell me that the studio was very close. One parent told me it was on fire, but they had mixed signals from obviously lots of things being put through social media. So when I found out it was close, I asked my dad to go and have a look. He went down as far as he could, and at that time the road was blocked off, and he wasn't allowed there, but then they opened that road up and he checked the studio and went into the backyard of the studio and saw that the fire was behind the studio, but at that stage not directly in line with the studio. It was close. He was quite worried about it, so he went and picked my mum up and came back, and they tried to retrieve some of our costumes from the costume room. We've got about $40,000 worth of costumes. They are insured, but the work involved in them, even what they're insured for, probably wouldn't cover it. So they took some of the costumes. They couldn't take all of them because there's so many. They took a carload of costumes and took them home, and at that time the fire, the CFA told them that they needed to leave that area at that time.
Now, you were able to get back to Morwell, to your parents' house, about 9:30 that evening.
Yeah, we went through Mervyn North.
And you stayed there that evening?
Yes.
Did you return home to your place in Tarwin Street the next day, the Monday?
We returned that evening. Mm-hmm. We got through to our home that evening at about 9 o'clock, and it was quite smoky inside. We took a few possessions that Mum and Dad hadn't been able to fit in their car and went back to their house that night. I couldn't stay there. It was definitely too smoky, and you could see the haze through the house, probably to waist height. Yeah.
When you went back the next day, on the Monday, what was the smoke level like in your street?
It was pretty similar to what it was the day before. We live in an older style house, so obviously there's not as much ventilation as there would be in a newer home. So we found that the smoke really was quite well contained in our home. Outside it was very dark and hazy. Even driving down from my mum and dad's house on the other side of Morwell to our place, you couldn't really see that far in front of you. You could see maybe 15 metres in front of you, and then from there it was quite hazy, and very dark.
What did you decide to do about your dance studio in that first week?
So when the fire happened, we weren't sure sort of where to go or what to do. There was quite a lot of hysteria on Facebook with parents saying that they weren't prepared to bring their students to class because they were concerned for their safety. So we didn't run the Monday after the fires, purely because of that. Everything that we'd read, we didn't believe that there was anything telling us that we couldn't run the classes. So we commenced classes on the Tuesday from there. And in that time I'd contacted the EPA and tried to look for any other places I could contact to find out whether it was safe for us to be there. But it was very hard to find someone that could tell us if we were or weren't. Obviously, not being a government agency, we didn't have anyone in direct contact with us as to whether the building was safe to be in. So, yeah.
All right, so you continued your dance classes from the Tuesday.
Yeah.
Were you living in your house in Tarwin Street during that week?
No, I went home a few days for probably 45 minutes. That was long enough to be there. It was quite bad in our house, and the smell and the smoke, you could just feel straight away when you went into there that it was definitely more challenging to breathe, and I wasn't going to bring my 2-year-old home to that. My husband went home to collect things more often than I did, just because being pregnant I wasn't sure if it was safe or not. And my mum and dad's home, even though still in Morwell, they live right on the other side towards Traralgon, and their house was so much clearer than ours. So,
You say in paragraph 12 of your statement that after a few days you came home and you were going to try to stay at home that evening.
Yeah, we did.
But you decided not to.
Yeah, I'd worked that evening at the studio and I'd noticed on the way home that it was quite bad. Driving home from the studio, the smoke was quite bad, and when I got inside, I just felt like it had got worse in the house. I said to my husband, I don't want to stay here tonight. I woke up my son and we took him to my mum's, and that was at about 10:30 at night. At the studio, it was quite bad too. By that time of night, there was a difference in the smoke, and you could actually feel the smoke in the studio, which wasn't present, I felt, the days before. Each day was very different. So some days it was clear at the studio, some days it was very bad at home. Some days at home it was clear, and some days it wasn't as good at the studio. Yeah.
Now, I'd like to ask you about the weekend of the 15th and 16th of February. You had some rehearsals scheduled at the studio that weekend. About how many children were at the studio rehearsing on the Saturday the 15th?
So it was approximately about 70 students, and we at the beginning of the year we put out a rehearsal schedule with competition students, and we'd called 2 days of rehearsals, the 15th and the 16th. They were all-day rehearsals starting at 9 o'clock until 5 p.m. On the Saturday, the students arrived in the morning and it was a pretty clear day. That's why we continued with the rehearsals, because Morwell looked like it normally did that morning. The kids came in and started practising and learning dancing, and then it got to about lunchtime and one of the parents came in and said, there's something going on, there's fire trucks sort of coming around telling people to close their doors and windows, and they'd actually yelled out to somebody outside the studio and said close all doors, and it was then that I got the CFA warning that there was higher levels of carbon monoxide in the air, and that all residents were recommended that they went into their homes and shut all doors and windows. We'd had all doors and windows open at the studio because prior to that we thought we would let air into the studio, thinking it's such a nice day, we'll let any sort of smoke out of the studio. However, once we heard that, we closed everything up. We kept going because the fire brigade said to us that it was safe to remain in the building. They said just continue with what you're doing, and if there's any further concern, we'll come back and let you know. But once we got that message, my gut feeling was that I don't want to be liable for anything that happens to these students while they're in my care. So myself and my business partner text messaged and rang parents to come and collect their students, some of which lived 45 minutes to an hour away, because we have students from everywhere. We have students from Track, we have students from Rosedale, we have students from Erica. So kids were being picked up from far away. So once the parents found out, they picked their students up. And by then, the air level was definitely noticeable. I felt like I was having trouble breathing. I don't know whether it was a bit of anxiety too, because it was a pretty stressful day. And the kids were sort of, you could see the difference in the kids. There was probably 6 kids that were there the longest. And I noticed they were but they were panicking as well. So, and I felt quite lightheaded and a bit unusual, but I don't know whether that was the air or whether it was just me getting a bit worked up being pregnant. So then by about 2:30, 2 o'clock, 2:30, we'd all left the premises by then, myself and my business partner. And, yeah.
So that was about an hour and a half after the CFA Watch and Act message.
Yeah.
And then later that afternoon, or early that evening, you received a text message telling you that it was all right to open doors and windows and go outside.
Yeah.
If you went outside at that point, what were the conditions like? What was the air quality like?
The air quality from that I found from that point on, the air quality was noticeably different. On some days it was definitely worse than others. Probably the smell was the thing that I noticed the most. That real smoky smell was something I think that even though that may not have been, I suppose, representative of the actual air level, the smell was it changed quite significantly over the days. The following day was still not great because the night of the 15th, my business partner and I decided to cancel the lessons for the following day because there were so many parents on social media saying thank you for cancelling classes and putting our students' safety first, all that sort of stuff. So we thought it was just we hadn't been formally told that we couldn't, and we had rung we tried to ring who would be able to help us, but at that time there wasn't a lot of information about who to contact. So the only people that were contacted during that weekend and the following week were the EPA, who myself and my business partner, they were our number one group to call. We called them in regards to the air levels.
All right, and you contacted them either on the Sunday or the Monday the 17th?
The Monday I definitely contacted them.
And you say that you spoke with a man from the EPA who said it was fine, levels were safe in the building, but didn't recommend strenuous physical activity.
Yeah.
I don't know how strenuous the dance classes you teach are, but how did you decide to go ahead with your dance classes?
That was quite challenging on the Monday because obviously with our business, the students are all invoiced on a termly basis and the kids are all expected that they're going to have their classes. We had a lot of parents that were, I suppose, not wanting to bring their students because of putting them at risk. We had others saying, I've paid for the classes, we're coming, I've paid my money, I want what I've paid for. We didn't know where to stand because we wanted to run classes because we felt it was safe, but we wanted to make sure that it was. We rang the EPA and he said that it was totally safe to be in the building. However, physical activity was not recommended. And I spoke to him about redevising the classes so that they would be less physically strenuous. And he just said, look, at this stage, just be careful with physical activity because of the air levels. So we spoke to the parents and the students and we said that parents could send their children at their own discretion. If they felt that they would like to send their child, they could. If they didn't want to. And we took that lead from St Vincent's Primary School, who's also in Morwell, who wrote the same message on their webpage to say that students could be sent to school at parents' discretion because we had no one else to contact at that time. We lessened the physical activity. We did ballet classes instead of jazz classes those days. And just with the kids did more technique, working on technique, which obviously was sitting on the floor, stretching feet, working off the bar, so they weren't running around in the rooms and getting out of breath.
So you continued with the dance school during the second week?
Yep.
And then the third week, you and your family went on holiday to Merimbula, where the air was fresher.
Much fresher, yeah.
And while you were away, your business partner contacted you on the Thursday of that third week, very concerned about whether she should continue with the dance school.
Yes.
What discussion did you have with her that afternoon?
She messaged me quite stressed, saying that the parents had mentioned to her, many parents had mentioned to her that they weren't happy that the school was still open. At this stage, the schools in Morwell were still running. I think Commercial Road may have been about to be relocated, but at that stage, no one had been relocated. So we were following primary schools pretty much with what we were doing. So she rang me and said, I think we're going to need to close because it's just getting ridiculous. Parents are coughing and looking like they're sick. We had a teacher sent home because she was having headaches and felt sick. Kids in class were saying they had headaches and felt like they were going to be sick. So she said, it's getting a little bit scary now. I think we need to stop. So we stopped that next day. We didn't run classes on the Friday. So you didn't open
on the Friday the 28th?
And that was the day that they announced that more residents in particular areas would be asked to relocate.
And your school is in that area and the children you teach are in a vulnerable group.
Yes.
Were you able to find somewhere else to run your dance classes?
Yes, so we stopped, the Friday we stopped and closed. Over that weekend we investigated a heap of different halls in Gippsland and contacted lots of different places to find if we could get somewhere with 3 spaces, because we have 3 studios, and we were lucky enough to find a hall in Yallourn North that had 3 separate spaces, so we relocated the studio to Yallourn North and commenced classes on that Monday. Many kids, well, there was a significant amount of kids that weren't able to travel to Yallourn North because it was obviously too far from a lot of places from where they were coming from. So some students ceased dance for that period of time until we knew what we were doing from there.
And did that mean that you were paying rent on 2
Yes.
separate spaces?
Yes.
How long did you continue in the new premises?
3 weeks.
And then after the Chief Health Officer had lifted her advice
Yeah.
that vulnerable groups should relocate, you returned?
Yeah, in the 3rd week, my water actually broke at Yallourn North 2.5 weeks early, nearly 3 weeks early. So in the third week we're at Yallourn North, the announcement was made on the Monday that it was suggested that people relocated were safe to move back. We didn't find that out until late in the Monday afternoon, and by then it was too late to tell parents we were back at the studio, but it was also still unsafe because the studio hadn't been cleaned yet. So we decided to continue that week in Yallourn North until we knew that our premises were safe to be back at. And on the Wednesday of that week is when my water broke. Yeah.
Yes, and then you were preoccupied with other matters for a little while. But before we, probably still are, before we leave the effect on the dance school and the arrangements that you made to relocate, I just want to ask you about the cost involved in that. Did it affect your business financially?
Yes, so we applied for the grant that was offered to Morwell businesses. We added up our costs as best as we could, and they came to approximately $11,000. And of that, we received a grant for $5,000.
All right, so there's $6,000 that the business is out of pocket.
Yeah.
All right. Let me ask you now about your family situation. You gave birth to your daughter on, was it the 20th of March?
Yes, over Thursday. Yeah.
And as you've mentioned, she was 2.5, 3 weeks
Yeah.
before her due date.
Yeah.
And that was just a couple of days after the Chief Health Officer had said that it was safe for vulnerable people to return home. How did you manage the return home?
So the Monday we were told that we could return home. I wasn't obviously prepared to return home yet because it wasn't clean, and I knew we had relocated significantly, so we hadn't been in and out of the house. We hadn't been opening it up or anything like that. So when we got home, it was a real mess. There was ash, and it was still quite smoky in the house. So I ended up ringing the Shire on the Wednesday that my water broke Wednesday at 6:30, and I rang the Shire at about, it must have been about 11 o'clock on the Wednesday to ask them if there was any assistance with cleaning, because something had been put on the news to say that people might be offered some help with the cleaning, and at the time they said they were only taking names of people, and that when they knew more about what funding they were going to get, they would contact those people on that list. So I left that, and then I needed my mum to go in and clean. So on that Wednesday, I had Electrodry come. I rang them, and they came while I was in hospital and cleaned the carpet, curtains and couch, and my mum did the rest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you've subsequently made some inquiries about having your roof space cleaned.
Yeah.
initially through your insurance company. What was the initial response to your inquiry?
So when I contacted GIO Insurance, which is my insurance company, they told me that any claims from Morwell would be declined because our policies only cover a fire that's within 10 metres from the property. And as the mine fire wasn't 10 metres, that nothing would be covered.
It's close, but not quite that close.
Yeah. And then from there, I rang them at the beginning of the mine fire to see if there was anything we were entitled to. I rang them a few weeks later, and they continued to stand by that there was nothing offered. And then I said to, I'd spoken to the Shire, and they had said that there was somebody collecting information about people whose insurance companies hadn't been offering anything, and to take all information to them as they were building, I suppose, a case against insurance companies that weren't looking into it. I met with them here and spoke to a lady who took down my story, and after that I rang GIO again to ask for a letter of decline. It was that day that when I asked for the letter of decline, they said to me that they would now, it would take 5 days for the letter to reach me. I was quite upset about that. So I said to them, okay, I'll wait 5 days. And then about 2 hours later, they rang back and said that they would now send out an assessor. But the assessor wasn't sent out until my house was cleaned by my mum and everything else had been done. So my house was quite clean by the time the assessor came out. The only thing that wasn't was the roof cavity, of which the assessor didn't go and look at because he said that it would probably look like everybody else's in the street. And I had Carver Corp come and look at the roof before they came, but didn't give them the quote just so that I could get a second opinion on the roof. And Carver Corp checked my roof cavity, and they told me that it would be just under $6,000 to have cleaned, and the insulation needed to be replaced as it was damaged with ash.
All right. And why are you particularly concerned about cleaning the cavity of your roof?
Probably because we live in a Californian bungalow style of home, so if the roof is quite pitched, and we have vents all around the house quite high, and I just found my kids, it may not be the cause, I don't know that it is, but the kids have been sneezing a lot, and we were sneezing a lot, and the kids were coughing, and with a new baby it just made me quite panicky that there was quite a bit of ash up there. So that was probably the first concern, but at that cost we couldn't afford to have that done.
So when you made the statement, you hadn't received a formal response from the insurance company. Still no response?
I have had them contact me, and they've provided us with a $4,700 what they call goodwill payment, which was received I think 2 weeks ago. I'm not positive of that date. And we've had to pay she told me that they had decided to give $5,000 as a goodwill payment to the residents of Morwell. However, it was not linked to your insurance policy, and that you needed to pay your excess, and our excess was $300.
Right, the last thing I'd like to ask you about, you started the story by telling us that you're looking at building on a new block. And does it follow that you're also wanting to sell the house that you live in Tarwin Street? You had the house valued late last year or early this year?
Yeah, January this year, 185 to 190,000. We don't have a backyard, so they said that was pretty right for what our house would be worth. And now I don't know. Yeah.
And I suppose that's another reason why you would be wanting to clean the roof cavity.
Yeah.
Right, thanks. I have no further questions from Ms. Burke. Do any members of the board have questions?
Thank you.
On your little girl. I've had no indication from anyone else that there are questions. So on that basis, could Ms. Burke please be excused?
Thank you.
Recall Ms. Tabane.
have made an affirmation.
Mr. Bain, I'm sure you've been present in the hearing room whilst the previous witness gave her evidence, and it brings home, does it not, in a very practical way, the importance of clear messages in emergency situations, because of course it's not only the health and well-being of the recipient of the message that's important, but they may have responsibility for others, for example children, that are looking to them for guidance. Now, returning to your evidence, I think I'd reached a point where you told us about MJPIC and its coordinating role, and I was about to go on to a different topic, which is to get some sense from you about what pre-planning there had taken place before the 9th of February that enabled you to hit the ground running, so to speak, in relation to communications. I don't see anything in your statement about that. You do refer to a communications and stakeholder engagement strategy which was developed during the course of the fire and came into operation on the 20th of February, the 12th day of the fire. The witnesses that gave evidence this morning, who I think you heard, Professor McNamara and Mr Drummond, were critical of the absence of pre-planned communication strategy. Would you like to comment on that, please?
So in relation to preparation for the season, amongst the things that we do, we train media officers.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a number of people throughout government media relations that actually receive training on what to do during an emergency. There are some templates around communication strategies. We make sure that we have what we call a surge list, so we have people trained and ready to be deployed in case of an emergency. There are a number of things like that we've actually done. Have we actually planned, had we thought about if there's a coal fire in Morwell? We hadn't gone to that level of detail of planning.
All right. What about the question of the identification of community leaders? This is something you refer to in your statement at paragraph 115. As I understand the evidence you're giving there, you say that you personally came down to Morwell on the 21st of February with others, and the visit enabled you to identify some local leaders who could assist in communications and community engagement. Firstly, who were those people? Not necessarily their names, but what categories of people are you referring to there?
There were some people involved with Cal communities. There are different, sorry, I have it in my notes, which is in the car, but we actually met, so myself and the head of Department of Premier and Cabinet Communications, Liz Mutton, and Dr Jeff Russell and I met with both council and spoke to them, their communications people, also with the editor of the Latrobe Valley Express.
Yes.
And actually talked about the different people that we could possibly engage with, who we might be able to utilise for community meetings and as facilitators and to talk about different issues. Some of that work had already been done. So I know at the community meeting on the 18th,
yes,
a local GP was actually in attendance and spoke, but was, and I think the term that was fed back to me was he was actually held down by the community. So there was a person with local experience, local knowledge, as you would say, a trusted source in the community, but the community wasn't actually receptive to what he was saying. So in terms of relying solely on trusted local sources, it is not quite as simple as that.
I understand what you're saying. My question's a slightly different one. That's work that could be done in advance of an emergency, isn't it? The identification in a locality of those sources. Mr Lapsley, in his statement in relation to communications, this is Exhibit 1, says, and I don't need this to be brought up, but I'll just read it out to you, it's brief. He says, one thing that did not work well in respect of communications initially was making use of established local community engagement structures and networks. He says this was a lesson learned for us. Was it a lesson learned for you as well? would you say?
There were many lessons I learned through this process.
All right, let's just take them one at a
but
time.
With this one in particular,
Yes.
there are many... So, in an ideal world, with lots of resources, lots of staff and lots of capacity to do that kind of work, absolutely that is textbook work that you would be doing.
Yes.
If I had lots of staff, that is exactly what we would do. We would have established net, we would have staff who would be able to undertake that work, and that would be ideal, and I would love to have that. With my current staffing, and you referred earlier to the fact that this operates on top, I do this on top of my regular job,
Yes.
my day job. I don't have additional staff that I can actually give to do that kind of pre-planning work.
Yes.
If I did, and if other parts of government did, that is exactly the sort of thing that you would do. And it would put us all in a better situation.
I'm thinking of your coordinating role. I'm not expecting you to be out doing a roadshow, Mr. Bain, but I'm thinking, for example, the CFA has as good a regional network of people, including information officers and others, and I'm thinking about the future and the way the inquiry can contribute to help in the future with the sort of work you're doing. Isn't that a resource that you could draw upon so that you could come up with lists at least of local people who might be able to be called upon to assist not on day 12 of a fire but perhaps earlier on in the course of some future emergency?
It would be certainly something, it certainly would be happy to look at. It's an area that I would certainly like to expand on for sure.
Yes.
Could I just interrupt there? You do mention at paragraph 112, a couple of lines, the CFA having particular expertise and depth in community engagement, part of their business model. Is that just something you're generally aware of, or are you aware of the specifics of how they go about that and whether that could be enhanced in some way?
It is, well, I am aware of it, and certainly something that I'd like to utilise more.
So you need to know more as to whether it's worthwhile trying that particular avenue as against some other.
It's one avenue. I would like to actually take a considered view rather than just simply saying that's necessarily the only way to go.
Could I just come in there as well? So, is there any pre-planning going on anywhere in the state? And I'm just thinking that this is a critical strategic resource for the state. These open-cut coal mines, which are very near communities, so clearly they weren't a priority. But I mean, are there any preparedness plans of this nature at the moment? To the best of my knowledge, there are some. Maybe not necessarily around open-cut mines. I couldn't tell you that for sure. So perhaps could we find out where these plans exist and which communities?
Just to pick up on Professor Gatford's point, we know that, in part as a result of the Royal Commission into the Black Saturday bushfires, that a great deal of work has been done in terms of preparedness for having incident management teams in place at particular locations in readiness for days like February the 9th of this year. But there does seem to be a lot less, as I understand the evidence you're giving, less that's been done in terms of preparedness for meeting the Fire Services Commissioner's number 2 priority, which is this whole idea of communicating, messaging, warning and so on.
No, there certainly is, and there are structures in place. That's why committees like MJPIC actually exist.
Yes.
The focus with that question has been around fire.
Yes.
And it's in that sense that we actually are quite prepared, and there is a lot of work done. On February the 9th, as it was, there are a number of fires across the state.
Yes.
We were there, I and along with many of my colleagues were actually in the State Control Centre working, and it was the day we were prepared for. So in terms of the stand-up, stand-down, quick fire situation, we actually are we're very well prepared. So there is a preparedness plan, there's work that's done at the time, and then there's relief and recovery. So in that sense, there is, but it would be true to say it is really more focused on the quick event, the fire, rather than a longer term event such as this one.
And just before leaving this issue of preparedness, you include in your statement some some statistics about the demographics associated with Morwell. This is starting at paragraph 31 on page 3. And you say, and certainly the experts who gave evidence this morning would agree, that knowledge of Morwell's demographic characteristics was critical for effective communications. That's paragraph 31. And then you go on and say that some information was pulled together by DHS and was provided to MJPIC members on the 17th of February. So that's, 9 days into the fire, this information was pulled together about the demographics. And as we've heard, and as you set out in paragraph 34, there are some quite significant, not unique, but significant characteristics about the local community which differentiate it from the rest of Victoria. And we've heard about internet connectedness, if that's a word, is one of those things. That's another thing that could be done in advance, isn't it, of an emergency like this. You could have that information available to you, obviously not just about Morwell, but about communities throughout Victoria that could be immediately fed into a communication strategy.
Absolutely, it's one of the things we've had. We've already had a lessons learned session. We have a number of other sessions scheduled in, some other workshops, and pulling together of that sort of statistical information and having it ready and sitting there is one of the things that we are looking at doing. However, I would just actually like to add that, and this is one of the things in reflecting back, because I've done a lot of reflecting back on the situation here in Morwell. A town, a community is a lot more than the statistics. So we can sit here and say, and we did, we reacted and we changed, we adjusted what we did when we saw those statistics. But it's actually a lot more about its history, its experience. I would actually say we could do a lot of the same things that we did in Morwell in another town that had not had the same history and issues that Morwell has had, and they may very well be successful. There are particular things that are unique to every town. And communities such as Morwell are more than an agglomeration of their statistics, as they are in the census and in the ABS. And a lot of that is around community history and shared experience.
Mr. Rosen, Mr. Bain, Mr. Rosen will address this, but you just mentioned then that you've had a lessons learned workshop.
Yep.
So are those matters articulated in your statement just towards the end?
Some of them are.
And is it an exclusive list? You've covered all of them or only just some?
No, only just some. There are quite a few, and there's still things that we're working through. And it's one of those situations where when you're in the situation, you're actually thinking to yourself, oh gosh, I wish I'd actually done this earlier. I wish I had done these things. You're in the middle of a situation, you're trying to work your way through it. And you're looking back, you're in week 2 or week 3, and you're thinking, why didn't we do this in day 5 instead of day 10. It's as a professional and as someone who cares, it's just a constant part of wanting to do these things better next time round.
So obviously you're recording those to make sure that those lessons are captured and utilised and implemented.
Absolutely.
Not much happens in the public service without documents being produced. Is there a written record of that lessons learned workshop, I think
Yes,
you said? Could that be provided to the inquiry, please?
Yes, it could.
Thank you. Just before leaving the demographics, I need to ask you, why did it take 9 days to pull that information together? You had MJPIC meetings every day during that period. Why did it take so long to get that basic demographic data together?
As I said in the statement, really that first week of the fire, from my perspective and from MJPIC's perspective, the issue of smoke and health and wellbeing of the community really wasn't an issue that was raised. It really, for us, this is advice provided to us, it seemed the issue really was around the fire in the mine and the issue, the threat to power supply, which is what most of the conversations seem to be about. That weekend, that's referred to, that is really when things start to shift and everyone understood that this is actually something different. And it's more than just a fire within a contained space, which is the understanding that we have.
All right. Perhaps I should take you to paragraph 45, which is where you make that point in your statement. You referred to that weekend of the 15th and 16th of February, and we just heard Ms Burke talking about that weekend as well and the significance of it. You say that it was on that weekend the issue of smoke and haze at Morwell started coming to the fore as a matter of potential concern due to a warning issued by the incident controller around elevated carbon monoxide levels. And then you go on the following week, that's the week commencing Monday the 17th, a greater understanding was gained around the raised levels of carbon monoxide as well as the particulate matter contained in the smoke and ash which was emanating from the mine. Can I just take you to one document which seems somewhat at odds with what you're saying there, and I just want to ask you to comment on it. This is a meeting of the State Emergency Management Team, and it's an attachment to Exhibit 36, which is a statement from Mr Poll, a Deputy Secretary with the Department of Education. It's specifically behind tab 42, which I hope is being put in front of you. You were present at the State Emergency Management Team meetings during this first week of the fire, I think.
At some of them, either myself or my assistant director was, yes.
Okay. And as we've heard from Mr Lapsley and others, this is the senior-most team that was meeting on a regular basis to share information about the fires in general, and of course we're particularly concerned with Hazelwood. And the structure, as we understand it, is that different departmental representatives gave reports, situation reports to the meeting so that everyone had an understanding of the complete picture, presumably. And can I take you, please, to the final page of this? So this is a meeting of the 14th of February, so the Friday before that weekend. And you see there's a report there, just a little bit higher up, sorry. Yeah, that's it. MJ Pick, report provided by MJ Pick, approved by you. Was the report provided by you, or are you unable to say?
Sorry, I can't.
Okay. It was either provided by you or your deputy, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have it in front of you in the paper? It's the very last page of, before you get to the next tab, if I can put it that way. Do you see it there, MJ Pick, report provided by?
Yep.
If we read that, there's a summary of it, and I understand this is a summary, but it reads, the rising number of firefighters who've been treated for carbon monoxide poisoning at the open cut mine has prompted increasing community concerns. What were those community concerns that you were reporting there to the meeting? Or that were being reported by MJ?
It may, well, I'd be... from my recall, I imagine it would have been media reports, I suspect.
Yes. But the concerns were concerns that if the firefighters were being endangered by carbon monoxide, then perhaps we in the community of Morwell also might be. That was what you understood was emanating from Morwell, wasn't it? That was the concern?
Quite possibly at the time, yes.
All right. It goes on, this is being exacerbated by fire union complaints about unsafe work conditions. MJ Pick is coordinating a comms strategy to reassure the community and provide advice from health and the EPA on how to mitigate the effects of the smoke. So it is the case, isn't it, that at the very latest, when this report was being provided, which seems to be the 13th of February, if we look at the date, these issues were firmly on the agenda, weren't they, of both the SEMT, but more importantly of your coordinating committee?
Yes, but in terms of, I guess that the size, the scale of it was really not something that we had grasped and understood.
Well, I suppose what I'm wondering about is how could that be the case? Looking at this report, and I don't want to take you through all the other reports that were being made at this meeting, but certainly by the middle of this week, towards the end of this week, there was a great deal of discussion, wasn't there, around SEMT about community concerns about toxic smoke, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and so on.
From memory, the discussion really very much centred around the firefighters and within the contains of the mine rather than necessarily being broader. And again, not being an expert, not being a firefighter, not being someone that's knowledgeable in that area.
Yes.
The discussion from memory was that it was people who were actually there dealing with the issue, actually fighting the fire, rather than it being widespread across the whole of the town.
All right. Just before this, I need to take you to just at the bottom of that section, emerging issues. Do you see that? Community concerns about toxic, in inverted commas, smoke, impacting on residents near open cut mine. MJ Pick is coordinating the media strategy. It seems to suggest that the media strategy was informed by an understanding of those community concerns as at this stage. Do you agree with that?
To a point, yes.
Okay. Now, if we can move on to some other matters that you talk about in your statement, and I understand that you're not responsible for the content of messages. I think it's important, is it not, for the inquiry to understand that. The agencies are putting out the messages. You're operating in a coordinating capacity, overall strategy and the like. Excuse me a moment. Paragraph 83 of your statement, you say that the fire presented complex and unique public information challenges in comparison to other fires burning across the state. What were the complex and unique public information challenges that it presented?
As I alluded to before lunch, actually, it being, as opposed to a simple bushfire, as opposed to a bushfire where the issues really are around threat to life,
yes,
and damage to property. The situation with the fire here at Hazelwood presented issues around health and well-being. It presented issues around safety of workplaces. It was not as simple as a threat to life. So you need to evacuate people because they're simply in danger of being burnt out. So it's across many different issues, many different agencies. It's a much more complex environment than a bushfire in a town.
You talk about the use of social media.
Yep.
This is starts at paragraph 100 of the internet and social media, paragraph 100 of your statement. And something I'd just like you to comment on. You say no new websites were created for this emergency, and you note the various departmental and agency websites. Is that something that you've thought about in hindsight? Is there something to be said for a dedicated, I'm not sure what the technical term is, but a dedicated website for an event like this that enables people to go to one place and then perhaps be referred on for more detailed information to departmental
Absolutely.
devices?
And the Emergency Victoria site is one that is being developed to be that site. It simply wasn't ready for this season. That's the intention, so that there would be one place that people would have to go. We were very conscious that in the communications we were sending out to people, in the advertisements that we were running, that we would have sometimes 2 or 3 website links at the bottom of the pages, and we knew that wasn't optimal. The Emergency Victoria site is intended to be that one place for people to go.
Is that part of the transitioning to Mr Lapsley's new role
Yes.
as Emergency Services
Yes.
Commissioner?
Yes.
Right. Emergency Management Commissioner.
I wonder if I could just pick up the theme of social media, just as you're on this paragraph 103. You talk about establishing a social media command centre on the 26th of February. I mean, it goes without saying that's a very long time after the commencement of the fire, and also linking it to the evidence we heard this morning from Professor McNamara, and particularly the Boston Marathon bombing, where they actually established within 90 minutes of the bomb going off a social media communication system through the police department. So we have a very long period before we get some command centre going, and and that experience in the US. I mean, do you want to just unpack why it took so long or what your thinking was there?
So there had been monitoring of social media up until that point, and we had been utilising it through both, in particular, CFA, who has in excess of 300 followers on their Facebook page, and Victoria Police, we have in excess of 100,000. So we had been utilising it. The command centre was a bit different in as much as the intention there was to not only monitor but actually respond to, in a factual way, misinformation that was being promoted through the community. Did it take too long? Yes, it did, and it's something that, in retrospect, it's one of the things that I would do almost instantly rather than actually waiting. So, absolutely.
Thank you.
From new ways of communicating to old-fashioned ones, paragraph 110, you talk about the community meeting that occurred on the 18th of February. We've heard a lot of evidence about that, and I think it was raised earlier today, Mr Lapsley describing it as a turning point in his approach. And I just want to ask you a couple of things about that. You list the people who were there, representatives of departments. You say that GDF Sewers was present. Other evidence would seem to suggest that they weren't. In fact, that they were conspicuous by their absence seems to be the evidence we've heard today. What's the basis of you saying they were there?
My understanding from the communications person who was there at the meeting was that they were present but didn't actually speak, but didn't make themselves known.
I see.
That is my understanding, so, and that's on the evidence that was given to me.
Okay. You weren't at the meeting, of course,
No,
so that was something that's been told to
Yep.
you. You identify that it was that strong concerns were expressed by residents. That's a fairly polite way, I think, of describing what happened. People were quite angry, weren't they? That's what the inquiry has been told. And you give some explanation for why that might have been the case. You say at paragraph 111, at that meeting there were not enough people present who were sufficiently senior to give definitive answers, and many local residents expressed their strong concern. Was there a particular area of concern raised where that you're talking about, where there weren't authoritative people to answer the questions? In other words, was it firefighting? Was it health? Was it monitoring? Where was the deficiency?
My understanding was it was in particular around monitoring, air monitoring and health at the time. But as I said, there was a GP there. And it's that mix of, that balance of trying to actually engage local representatives and having experts at the same time. So, and look, I'm completely in agreement with Mr Lapsley on that meeting being an absolute turning point. But it was those two areas that were from what was communicated to me, it was really the air monitoring and the health that were the areas of key concern.
Okay. One of the attachments to your statement that you've provided us with, and this is behind tab 59, which is in that folder ahead of you. They're right towards the end. I think if I could ask you to look at that. It should also be on the screen next to you. Just waiting for that to come up. That from the document at the top right-hand, from the date at the top right-hand corner, appears to be a document. Can't blame Mr. Reardon this time. The date on it appears to be the 13th of February 2014. Do we take that as being an accurate date for when this was produced? And it's a document, if we, without having to go to it on the screen, it's signed off by Trevor White, Deputy State Controller, on that date. Was Mr White a member of the State Emergency Management Team? It's not a name that we've come across to now, but certainly he seems he was part of the command structure.
Yes,
all right.
possibly, yes.
It's headed Planning for and Providing Feedback from Community Meetings, And under the heading background, it tells us that at the State Emergency Management Team meeting on Thursday the 13th of February 2014, so some 5 days before this meeting that we're talking about, there was extensive discussion on the importance of gathering accurate and timely feedback from community meetings. It goes on, this is particularly important to ensure issues can be addressed at the level most appropriate in a timely manner. And then under the heading Issues Highlighted, if I can draw your attention to number 2, having experienced and senior members of local government present to support the conduct of community meetings. And then further down that page under the heading General Principles, second dot point, senior government and relevant non-government staff should attend to respond authoritatively and honestly to issues questions. My question is, given that level of foresight, apparently at the SEMT level, about what was needed to ensure that community meetings ran properly, and given how important community meetings were to provide proper information, how is it that 5 days later, with an incident being managed by such a senior management team in Melbourne, we end up with a meeting in Morwell where there aren't sufficiently authoritative people to answer questions? How did that happen?
It's an answer I'd like to have myself. It's the meeting, as I make clear in my statement, community engagement is not strictly within the responsibilities of MJPIC.
Understand.
The meeting that was organised, I believe was organised locally. Was it optimal? Obviously wasn't. So you would really have to ask the insect controller or whoever it was that organised that meeting. I know communication staff were there, they assisted, it had been organised, and when people are there they have a number of things that they do. They do media work, but they also will assist in other things. They assisted in this meeting as they would with others, but we weren't the primary organisers, so I can't answer that one for you.
See, people like the previous witness, Ms Burke, and many others that we've heard from in this inquiry were crying out for information about a situation that was challenging, it was difficult, the air was full of smoke, and here was an opportunity to engage and provide that information. And it's not surprising that there's anger in those circumstances if there aren't sufficiently authoritative people there.
I agree with you.
You'd have to agree with that.
No, I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah.
Mr Rosen, who did chair the meeting, Mr Devane?
It was, and I was a little horrified myself, one of the communications officers volunteered, I'll help out. So he facilitated the meeting, and I'm not sure that he would actually volunteer his services again. He was, it was out of goodwill. He wasn't trained. He was there and said, I'll help out. So.
If we can go back to your statement, please, paragraph 117. You say that the CFA's community engagement team, and we've heard a good deal about that, and generally positive, I must say, conducted regular surveys throughout Morwell and its face-to-face activities, the buses, the trains and so on. And then it's the final sentence of that paragraph I want to ask you about. The feedback from this activity eventually indicated most residents wanted simple, tailored information delivered to their letterbox or via a door knock. When did it eventually indicate that? At what point in this incident did that become clear, that people wanted face-to-face information along those lines?
This was one of the ways in which we actually obtained feedback. So one of the things that we did throughout our meetings, in particular when things became, as I said, they moved from strictly being an issue of fire to really, as I said, health and wellbeing, was we started to ask for feedback as a regular part of the meeting. So Latrobe City Council became a regular member of MJPIC. We would ask them to provide us any information on community feedback they received through their call centre or people who actually came to their counters. Members of the ICC or communications people from there, we would ask them to actually feed back into us any feedback that they received from the community, anything that they were being told, anything that would assist us in actually tailoring to help us to actually do our communications and do our work better. So the exact time, it was a continuous process. To say there was a specific date would be difficult. It was a regular part of the way we actually did our business. As communicators, you actually look for feedback that what you're doing is the right thing or the wrong thing, and you adjust and you move.
It's possible, isn't it, that in an age where the internet and social media are omnipresent, that we can lose sight of the basics in relation to communication. This is something Mr. Lapsley touched on when he first gave evidence here, and that is that there's a lot to be said for that face-to-face communication,
absolutely.
because it enables two-way discussions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Now, I want to ask you, you've...
Sorry, jump in just while we're on para 117, just the para before, you do talk about a senior media officer being stationed at Traralgon.
Yes.
And I'm not quite sure when that appointment was made or that decision was made, because clearly coordinating the communication roles between the various agencies is a pretty critical role. So can you enlighten us? Presumably it's after the 21st of February.
So and to the best of my recollection, it was as part of a discussion that I had with Louise Martin on the day that we actually came down into Morwell. It was really to help at a more local level. And one of the things that I refer to in the lessons learnt is the advantage of having a more senior person actually stationed within a centre rather than just operating from Melbourne. So they're the officers at work down here who do a great job and work extraordinarily hard. But often it's having a senior person almost at an executive level who has the capacity to synthesise and understand and relay, and at sometimes actually also push back on ideas, on issues that I think would be, for me, on the lessons moving forward.
So perhaps just follow through, I mean, if that person had been there a week earlier or even before that, that could have made a big difference, do you think, in terms of how all these messages would have come together?
For me, one of my recommendations on a personal level would be that I would actually ask to deploy a senior person there almost straight away.
Because we know, for example, that there were MFB firefighters down here within 48 hours. They were here. There was a recognition that the local CFA resources were inadequate. They were inadequate in numbers-wise. They were inadequate expertise-wise because it was a hazardous materials fire. So at that level, the response was, very prompt. And yet you've got this disconnect with the communications side of it to some extent. I think that's what we're interested in.
And for, again, the difference is in a stand-up, stand-down, quick situation, the responses that we have are more than adequate. Often it's my own staff from police meetings who are down attending a fire and managing at a scene. They're quite expert at it. This was one of these things where we've really not for a long time actually dealt with something that's of this length, and we didn't know that at the start. If we knew that at the start, we would have dealt with it quite differently, but we didn't. But like I said, it's certainly one of these things that I would like to do. For me, something I'd certainly be recommending that it occurs straight away.
I must pursue that issue with you because we've had a number of witnesses. It happened yesterday when Dr. Lester was giving evidence. This question of whether or not there was an awareness early on of the likely length of the incident. And I think you've just said to us we didn't know it was going to last for as long as it did. Mr. Lapsley's evidence and the documents, I can bring them up if need be, were at the State Control Centre level, State Emergency Management Team as early as, I think, the 12th of February, advice being given by him that this was a 30-day incident from his perspective. Was that something you weren't aware of in that first week?
Well, certainly not off the top of my... not that I can recall now, no. As a 30-day incident...
I'll just see if we can bring it up. We have a situation report. This is Exhibit 3. I'm just trying to find the specific reference. Bottom of page 3.
Just while Mr Rosen's finding that, who would be present at a state control centre? Or is this document submitted to the State Emergency Management Team? Can you just give me context of this document, who would write it and who reads it?
I think that's a question for you, Mr Bain,
Yes.
if you're able to tell us.
So generally, the person who attends the meeting would be providing information. It goes to all SEMT members. So anyone who is there, so members of SEMT would receive it.
So that would include you, MJP.
It would include me.
Yeah, so you'll see it there. There's a second dot point. After recognising there's a separate incident management team, the fire in the Hazelwood coal mine will burn for up to a month, which has significant long-term implications for the community. That was something you were aware of, was it not?
That sounds like nitpicking. We actually I wasn't receiving them. There was an issue with me actually being sent these. So whilst we were inputting in, we weren't receiving them back to read. And it is as it is. I don't recall that.
Okay. This wasn't secret SCC business,
No.
though. There were public pronouncements being made by Mr Lapsley and others about the likely duration of this incident during the first week of the firefight, were there not?
There was also information that there was success in fighting the fire. It was going to be more quickly extinguished than as things turned out. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but when someone that was certainly the information. It varied. It varied. There were times in which there was information that was being given that it was something that the firefighters were being extraordinarily successful. And again, information comes as this. I'm not an expert, and when someone says it looks like it's going to be extinguished quickly, I'll take that.
I know you're not an expert. No one's suggesting you are, but Mr Lapsley is, isn't he?
Yes.
Yes. And that statement's pretty unambiguous in terms of what his expectations were at that point in time. Are you suggesting he gave contradictory information to the SEMT on that issue?
Not necessarily. It's just that it changed at times. So there was other information that would come through that the firefight was extremely successful, and they were. And I know in some of the documentation there is that they actually had reached a point where they'd almost extinguished 3/4 of it. It was 2 steps forward, as it turned out, then 1 step back, or sometimes 2 or 3 steps back. It wasn't necessarily a linear process in terms of the firefight.
Did Mr Lapsley ever say anything to the SEMT that contradicted that initial indication that he gave that you're able to point us to?
It was certainly in conversations, reports that the firefight was actually possibly being more successful, less successful. It changed at times. This is not, as I said, it's not necessarily linear.
All right. You've attached to your statement a number of many messages that were sent out. You'd be happy to know I'm not going to take you to all of them. I only want to ask you about one of them because it does seem to exemplify a number of the issues that have arisen during the course of the inquiry. It's behind tab 64, and it's an EPA question and answer document that came out on the 24th of February 2014. Now, I know you're not at the EPA, you didn't develop the content of this. I'm more interested in your observations about it from the point of view of a communications specialist, and particularly whether some of these issues that I'm going to raise with you are part of your ongoing consideration that you've talked about lessons. And I particularly want to ask you about the 4th page of this document. So just for some context, it's just coming up slowly. We'll just bear with us a moment. Ends in 0217. Yeah. Just a bit further down. Bottom, that last one, that's it. Thank you. So just a little context about this. This is a 5-page publication put out by the EPA, an FAQ. This is a standard sort of communication document where questions are raised and then answers are provided. From the date, we can see the 24th of February. Reading through it, we can see these are the sorts of questions that were being asked in the community, raised specifically with the EPA. If you go to the 4th page of the document, please. Sorry, if I start on the 3rd page, bottom right-hand corner, you'll see in bold, you keep using technical, complicated language. Are you covering up by using this complex language? Asks the question. And that was a matter that was a recurring issue during this incident, wasn't it? And we heard it talked about again this morning, that the problems with using jargon are that people zone out and they don't like it. The answer the document provides is we're doing our best to keep it simple. Community safety is top of mind whenever we issue information, but this is a very complex fire involving lots of technical points. Now, it's true, there is a balance to be struck, isn't there, between providing easily understood information, but at the same time it's got to be technically and scientifically accurate. And that's got to be a challenge that arises in an incident like this. But having said that they're keeping it simple, I then want to draw your attention halfway down the left-hand column of that page 4. If you just stop there. The question is, the data on EPA's website looks alarmingly as if we've exceeded air quality standards. Is that right? Asks the question. Now, there's a simple answer to that based on the evidence that we've heard, uncontradicted evidence over days. The simple answer was yes. You know that, don't you? That's what the evidence that the inquiry's heard indicates. Levels 10, 20, even 30 times higher than the relevant standards of particulate matter. The answer that's provided, we can all read it, is anything but simple. Data readings are the actual scientific measurements for each air pollutant. The data readings are recorded in different units of measure depending on the type of pollutant. Then there's a table. Then it goes on. Data readings are converted into AQI values by using a formula. This means the AQI is a derived value. That just means it's based on the formula, AQI for each pollutant. It goes on and on. We don't know what AQI means. This is not good communication, is it, Ms. Tveit?
It's certainly not ideal. No, it's not.
I could go on with that answer. It doesn't even answer the question about the levels. It gives what, be a bit perhaps impolite, but it's gobbledygook, isn't it?
Well,
you can take that as a comment, as someone on TV would say. The next question, if I can ask you about, seems to raise another question. So if we can go up the page a little. Why did it take you so long to start monitoring air quality? Now, once again, that's a question that was being asked repeatedly during the course of this incident. And we know in this inquiry that it did take some time. Several days before any monitoring was being done, up to a week before there was proper calibrated monitoring that was being done. What's the answer? It didn't take us long. Well, it goes on. In fact, there are 2 permanent air monitoring stations in Morwell and Traralgon. Now, on one view, that's quite misleading based on the evidence we've heard. The Morwell station had been decommissioned. It was not operating when this fire started. And whilst there was a station at Traralgon, it was only monitoring PM10. Now, I know this is highly technical for you. My point is, if you accept that that's right, if you accept that that is the situation as at this time, then it's not helpful to provide information that's of questionable accuracy, is it?
Absolutely not.
No. And then finally there's a question, where is the mine in all of this? Why aren't we hearing from them? And once again, a question that people are asking repeatedly. And it's a reasonable question, isn't it, for members of the community to ask?
Yes, it is.
Can you read the answer out to us aloud, please?
The emergency services are managing this fire in conjunction with the mine.
Does that answer the question, in your view?
No, it doesn't.
It's a fudge, isn't it? That's a fudged answer?
It's certainly not. It's certainly not answering the question.
And I don't want to take you to document after document, but I think you've agreed there are problems with this style of communication on a number of levels, and I think you've indicated to us that part of your review, communications review of this incident, is taking into account these sorts of issues.
Yes.
Final matter I want to ask you about is back in your statement at paragraph 123. You make reference, just whilst that's coming up, you make reference there to some SEMC, you'll just have to remind me, State Emergency...
Management Centre for Health and Human Services, effectively there. We referred to them earlier, so Health and Human Services, Emergency Management Communications.
Yes, thank you. They organised and sponsored 2 workshops on the 13th of March 2014 for people assisting and supporting the Morwell community. You go on and describe the nature of the workshops, and they were entitled Communicating with People in Emergencies, and no one could criticise that the workshops were conducted. The question is, why the 13th of March when the fire had been declared under control on the 10th of March? Wasn't that a bit late to be conducting those workshops?
Was it an ideal time? I mean, would it have been better earlier? Absolutely.
Sorry, there is one final matter. Having told you that was the last, there's one more, and it concerns an issue that's been raised with us in community consultations, and you may or may not be able to help us, but do you know, and if not, we can ask other witnesses, which government agencies relocated out of Morwell during the course of this fire?
I wouldn't be able to give you an accurate answer on that one.
All right. The only reason I'm asking you is because we heard earlier today, I think you'd agree, that communication can take all sorts of forms, and relocating your staff out of an area is a form of communicating a concern about their health. Would you not agree?
Yes.
All right. I think that, yes, they are the questions that I have of Mr Bain. I'm told that Dr Wilson has some questions, but if any members of the board do.
2 matters, please, Mr Bain. Reading through your statement, and I think there's quite a number of parties involved, and if I take you to page 4 of your statement, you were attempting to be helpful, and I thank you for that, about sort of describing the abbreviations and the acronyms used. And I might just call on you, Dr Wilson, to be able to assist perhaps with your colleagues there. I would find it really helpful if we had a diagrammatic structure of the parties involved, particularly these acronyms, to show, I guess, the interrelation between them. Because I think that would just describe sort of how complicated it is, and I'm having trouble reading through the pages of information, and I'm sure the community, well, I'm just taking a guess that the community may not be able to also follow that. So might that be something that someone could assist me with? Thank you. And I guess on your point, Mr Rosen, and probably just for clarification, in tab 39 of Mr Bain's statement, waiting for it to come up on screen. So it's 0003 001 0166 VPOL.
That's it.
Thank you. The air quality and health paragraph there, this is on the 14th of February at 6 p.m, community information newsletter. The Air Quality and Health tells me as a member of the community that the EPA has air monitoring in place for fine particles in Traralgon and now in Morwell to measure the impacts of the smoke. So as a community member, I'd be reading that and saying, oh, that's good. Someone's looking out and they'll tell me if things aren't going well. And this may not be a question for you, Mr O'Bain, but in relation to communication, Dr Lester yesterday gave evidence to say that the early monitoring was not adequate data to make health decisions on. So do you have a comment on the fact that you're telling the community we're monitoring, but then the Chief Health Officer is saying that that data is not sufficient to make a decision on?
All I can say is that as communicators, we work with what we're given, the information that we're given. As doctors, all we can do is work from the information that we're provided with. So if the EPA is saying this is what's occurring, I have to take that on trust.
Do you think that there'd be a possibility the community would interpret that to say that there is an element of care in that's being monitored, therefore I would be told if the level is high?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Could I just follow, and could I say I very much appreciate your open and honest responses, and I think we do appreciate that. I'm referring now to paras 124 and 125 of your statement, and I'm just trying to sort of pull this together in terms of, I suppose, what your take-home message is to us. The way I read 124 and 125 is that essentially the government was trying to push messages on the community, and it's about, for instance, the bottom of 125, alternative methods of telling people things, of assessing whether your messaging is getting through. I mean, in terms of your responses and what we've heard this morning, it's not just about dumping messages, is it? And what's your view, or what is the mature best practice approach as we move forward in terms of communication?
And this is one of the things obviously we'd look to in the future. It's, as I said before, there really isn't a cookie-cutter approach to any community and communicating with any community. There are principles and guides that are best practice. Thank you. It's often about striking a balance between providing information which the community is after and listening to what they're saying as well. There is an element of information provision, and you can't actually walk away from that. People want to know what is going on, and we have to be able to provide that information to them. And obviously in the simplest, clearest way possible, regardless of their demographics. No one likes to actually be reading technical, highly scientific information. It doesn't make sense to people. So in terms of the provision of information, absolutely, as plain as English as possible. It's a fight that, as a communications person, and there would be very few communications people across private and public sector who wouldn't understand when I say that it's a fight that you have within every organisation. You get accused of dumbing things down when all you're actually trying to do is translate things into easily understandable English. And there is never, ever one simple way to actually provide that information and to hear back. Social media is actually one of the good things about social media, and one of the things that we, and this is where I'd actually would challenge some of the simple analysis around the data and statistics in the ABS census data. It talks about, and we understood that we had to not simply rely on the web because the data was telling us that not everyone was connected. However, one of the things that did surprise us a little was the level of social activism, because people have access through their phones. There are a number of different ways that people were able to communicate with each other It was not necessarily just sitting at a computer, it was using their mobile phone. One of the things that government and all organisations, I believe, need to get better at is listening and hearing and using every method possible, being either community meetings, feedback that's provided, as I said, through, we were talking to council about what was coming through their channels, or through social media and listening, hearing what people are saying, but actually understanding what they're actually meaning as well. And I think it's not I'm not sure that anyone actually has it right. And I don't just mean here in Victoria, I mean internationally. I don't think that effectively what you'd call the architecture of listening, of actually being able to hear what people are saying and interpret it and understand what they're meaning, that anyone has got it absolutely spot on. It's a learning process for us all.
Thank you. Questions for you from Dr. Wilson.
Well, pleases. Thank you, Ms. Tabane. You were present this morning when you heard the two gentlemen sitting in the joint conclave about effective communication. In your witness statement, you speak of the print media and you refer to the most effective print media method being the local newspaper. And what was your experience as to the success of that method of communication?
From the feedback we received, it was very good. It was well received. It's a highly and widely read publication in the community.
You've no doubt caught up with Dr. Lester's evidence about the various methods of communication employed by her, from tweets to door-to-door contacts and everything in between. From your professional perspective, are they all in combination effective tools?
Yes, they are.
Is one or more better than others, or is it necessary to use all of them in combination to be as effective as you can be?
As I've been saying, there is not a one-size-fits-all, and utilising every method of communication possible, particularly in a situation, an emergency or a crisis situation like this, you can't leave any stone unturned, so you have to use everything that's available to you.
You heard today that aspects of the local community were distrustful of information conveyed by government agencies. No doubt you'd agree that getting a message across to people who are inherently suspicious of the message that you're seeking to convey presents its own obstacles. If we proceed on the basis that effective communication is underpinned by trust, in a community which may not exhibit trust for the information that you're giving, how do you overcome that?
This is a difficult situation. I would actually say that the level of trust in the community didn't exist. Well, the level of distrust existed before the situation arose, before the emergency arose. And this is what I was referring to earlier about having a deeper understanding of the community with which you're working or communicating to. This is a community that's had a number of traumas and issues, problems with asbestos. This is not the first time there's been issues of health, risks to their health that they've experienced. This is a community that's actually had a lot of trauma, and the level of distrust of authority figures, I would say, existed before this emergency occurred. So in terms of actually trying to battle something, we were battling something that was there before we actually arrived. What do you do about it? This is not a simple solution. This is not something that can be done quickly. This is something that takes time. And it's not necessarily just a communications response either. This is something where government figures, community leaders, people have to actually do things, say they're going to do something, do it, deliver on it, and visibly deliver on it, to start rebuilding the trust. My view is that a lot of that level of trust had actually dissipated from this community before the fire actually occurred. It wasn't there to begin with. So a lot of the communications that we were giving them were actually in my view, probably, now that I have a deeper understanding of the community, we're always going to be struggled to be heard in the way that was actually being referred to this morning.
This might involve some crystal ball gazing, but how long do you estimate it could take before you could gain the community's trust so that the message that you give to them will be received with open ears?
It is a little bit, it is crystal ball gazing. It could be a year, it could be 2, it could be 3. But these are not, this is not an issue. These are things that have occurred over a long period of time, and you don't resolve these issues very quickly. You can't, and it's a term I absolutely loathe. You can't spin your way out of these things. Trust has to be earned in a community. And government leaders, community leaders, business leaders have to actually earn the trust of that community, and this takes time.
Could I ask whether you think the... sorry. Chairman, that would be your...
Sorry.
For present questioning, he's the incident commander.
When it comes to distrust, as Dr. Wilson has been referring, are there not a couple of examples of a person who shall be nameless, but everyone will know who I'm talking about, who does not have that distrust, and the community consultations reflected it, and an organisation, both linked to government, namely the CFA, I will name the CFA, who do have that trust, and what these events did was to increase the level of trust. So it's not something that is totally lacking and needs to be found, but is there with some people who, for whatever reason, have gone about it in an appropriately positive way. You can't identify why it is that they are able to have that trust.
You can, and the CFA is actually a good example. And if the issues that we were dealing with here or trying to communicate here were solely around fire, we wouldn't have possibly had the problems. The issues were, as I've said, they were across different agencies. The issues were not simply ones around fire. And the CFA have actually, they are part of this community. This is a community where they are well regarded, and they've worked well, they've delivered, and they've always done what their charter says. They've actually put a fire out, so they do have a level of trust. But there are certainly other elements of the community that have other levels of decisions and other influences on the way the community works that don't have that level of trust.
So, I think Sharon's made some point here, but if we were to just put...
If we were just to put the fire response and the CFA on one side and look at the remaining agencies, do you think the trust in this community has increased or decreased as a result of the events that occurred?
Like a lot of other people here, the only data I actually have available to me is through the community consultations. And that is one element of the community. This is a community of 15,000 people. At a shallow level, and this is really because it's only very much skimming the surface, I've not actually undertaken, there's been no research done that I'm aware of that would actually indicate a positive response. It doesn't seem to have, on the face of it, increased the level of trust from the community, but that is really only from some of the media reports that I've seen and the people that have actually presented the community consultations. And I'm not sure that is necessarily reflective of the whole community of Morwell. I'd have to see the evidence.
So you're saying it probably got worse. Is that what you're saying?
The indications from a very top line response is that it doesn't look like it has actually improved, no.
So it leads to the obvious. So what is your assessment of the effectiveness of the communication then?
Of what we actually did.
If the trust is not any better and possibly it's got worse.
in a situation where situations such as this, and this is something, as I said, I've actually been thinking about very hard since. I'm not sure. We did the best we could. We really did the best we could. The amount of work that we did, the attempt to actually provide as much information as we could to the community was done with the best intentions. We tried to adapt as we went along. We moved and changed, and we've been reflecting on what we did right and what we did wrong since. And again, as I referred to earlier about getting a senior person in to do an assessment extremely early on, which is made up of more than just analysing statistics and the census, but actually understanding the community at a more intelligent and emotional level as well, understanding its history, rather than just looking at the statistics that are presented. That is the sort of information that actually would guide a proper strategic approach to communications and an attempt to actually do it differently.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. This morning you may have heard, Mr. Bain, that some criticism was levelled at the state for providing too much information or information too often. Do you recall hearing that?
Yes, I do.
Well, to use one of Mr. Reardon's expressions, that created something of a tension because either you give too much information and people cease to read it, or you don't give enough information as the situation evolves and therefore the information you give ceases to be timely and accurate. In your professional view, which is the best way to proceed?
In a situation where it is constantly changing, you cannot hold back on information to the community. This situation was dynamic. It was changing day by day and at times by the hour. To actually withhold information from the community on the situation in which people were living and working, I think would have been grossly inadequate and reprehensible, quite honestly. You just cannot keep that sort of information from the community.
Of course, you no doubt proceed on the assumption that some people welcome, are grateful for, can understand and process complicated information, whereas others, without dumbing it down, just want the executive headline. Is that right?
Yes, they do.
Again, which method is best?
As I've said at other times, there is no one simple template. You have to use every channel, you have to use every means possible, and you have to provide the opportunities for people who actually want more information and more complex information to be able to find it if they so wish.
Because no doubt you took the view that some members of the community could in fact understand the highly scientific information that Mr. Rosen took you to before. They will make their own decisions about it, form their own conclusions based on it, and react predicated upon it as well. And you can't deny them that.
Absolutely not. As I said, a community is made up of much more than the statistics. So there are certainly people in this community who were... The website hits on the EPA sites and on the different sites that were providing the information tell their own story. There was a lot of people who actually went to those websites looking for that information and who wanted deeper information. To actually filter that and not make that available to them, again, would have been, I think, a very bad thing to have done.
Speaking of hits, in other information before the board, we know that there are 300,000 likes for the CFA Facebook in the relevant period.
Yes.
No doubt that was reassuring to you.
Yes. We have more than 100,000 on Victoria Police, not that we're comparing,
Just in case there's a single other person in the room who doesn't know what a like is, can you explain it to us?
It's a page that you follow on Facebook.
Great, thank you. You heard this morning from the two communication people who told us their evidence about the need for empathy in communications. It's probably self-evident. Do you believe that you and those through you and with you showed the requisite level of empathy when communicating? to the community in the events with which we're presently concerned?
Absolutely. I actually think all the key spokespeople delivered their messages with empathy. The question, as I said, really goes to the level of trust that existed beforehand. Dr. Lester, in many of her conferences, actually spoke about understanding what people were going through. Certainly, Craig Lapsley did as well. This was not something that people were ignorant to.
You were taken to certain MJ PIC information. Did we see that Sewers was among the participants in that organisation?
No, they weren't.
Well, you also spoke of the need to include business and industry in communications. What's the explanation for their absence?
We actually, so DSDBI is the government department through which that works with GDF Suez. So that's the department of, now I'm going to actually...
Back out the acronyms.
Yeah. Essentially the business and innovation and so they are the key liaison point with GDF Suez, and they were communicating with them. In terms of actually having them as a member of MJPIC, as government and as whilst understanding the need to have, obviously it would be good if they were at communicating, engaging and standing alongside us at times. The government and industry may not have ended up on the same side in this situation.
Right. You referred to a report of MJPIC 13 February about increasing community concerns. Again, at the risk of the self-evident, people might be concerned about events for a huge range of issues, some of which you know, some of which are rational, others which may not be rational. But I take it you recognise that no amount of assurance and no amount of explanation can, for some people, allay the concerns that they express.
Absolutely.
Well, how do you get through to those people, and how do you reassure them in the way that your information tells you they need or want?
This is difficult, and I certainly had sympathy for the residents in this, because they were living in a smoking environment. There was ash that was evident in their homes, on their cars. It was there, and they were seeing one thing and being told another. These things are never simple. The evidence that we were being provided was that it was safe. We had to keep working with that, understanding and empathising with the community that this was not necessarily the reality they were seeing. And so in respect for that, we actually suggested, and a lot of activity was undertaken to give people an opportunity to leave the area. V-Line actually were offering free trips, so there were something like 14,000 trips that were taken up. Free entry to the zoo. We were looking around for community events that were outside of the area to give people an opportunity to leave. Health and Human Services there was a respite centre, there was a health centre. There was a number of activities and other ways that people were actually given opportunities to seek information, be given information, and actually leave the areas, or if that's the way they so wish to do.
We've heard a lot about the effectiveness of social media in disseminating information to those who wanted it, or Twitter, of course, was used, and Facebook,
yes.
But that's technology and systems that exist in the year 2014. Project yourself ahead 10 years, we may not even perceive or comprehend what might be the effective tool, but are you taking steps to keep up with the evolution of technology to ensure that you get to those you need to get to?
As a communicator, I absolutely have to. That's an essential part of any of the work that I do. And one of the things that we're certainly, one of the projects that was in train anyway, is actually looking at how we monitor social media overall, in an overarching way for emergency services.
It was suggested or faintly put that no attempt was made to understand the preferred method of communication for all of the 15-odd thousand people of Morwell. Is it feasible to survey or somehow understand the preferred means of reaching individuals? And if it is, tell us how it might be done within reasonable bounds.
I actually would disagree that there wasn't. I disagree with the fact that the statement that there wasn't an attempt to understand the preferred method of communication for the residents, because we did. We tried. So hence we adapted. We moved to the letterbox drops. We moved to a whole range of communications. There were live radio reads there was between 6 to 8 conducted a day, and the messages there were adapted and changed as the situation changed. So we actually did a lot of things. And to understand the preferred method of communications, I'd say there isn't one. So when you actually look at any community, there would be people who are young people who have one preferred way of communicating. You have people in the middle age bracket, like myself, who have another. And then there are elderly people who, again, like a different form. There is simply, particularly in this day and age, there is simply more communication, more information everywhere. There is simply not a one-size-fits-all. And as I said, actually getting into a community, understanding the statistics that are there, but also understanding the history of a community and its cultures that are within it, and what has developed in its history over time.
Would you excuse me, please? Thank you, Mr. Bain. Thank you, Board.
Just one final matter, if I may, Mr. Bain. You were asked by my learned friend Dr. Wilson about whether you should provide too much information or too little information. The issue is really quality, isn't it, rather than quantity?
In this situation, I would say not necessarily. Well, when you're in a situation that is changing, I think getting the information out is of paramount importance. Air quality was changing from hour to hour, day to day.
Yes.
Smoke situation was changing. It was variable. It was predicated on the weather at times. This was not. There's the theories around communications in an ideal situation or in a campaign sense away from an emergency. And absolutely the quality of your communications has to be spot on. Yes. And again, it's one of the things that I've said we're certainly looking at in the future. But to hold back information if it's new or different or changing in a situation like this, I actually don't think is necessarily the right way to go.
All right. I'm not sure that anyone's suggesting that information be held back, but I think you've answered my question about the quality. Unless the members of the board have any further questions of Mr. Bain. Yes, looks like there might be one more.
One more. And I do appreciate the honest way that you've answered the questions. Thank you very much. The issue Dr. Wilson raised was around the point of empathy. Would you agree, being an expert in communications, that empathy is what's received by the person receiving the information, not necessarily measured by the person delivering?
In terms of yes, to an extent, yes, you're right. But as I said before, there are some times and some people who won't necessarily accept what people are saying regardless.
Yep.
So whilst someone might be actually exhibiting and saying things that indicate they actually have some understanding of the situation that people are in, if someone has literally put the shutters up, they won't hear it.
Yeah.
And it's it's very difficult to actually then break through that once those shutters have actually gone up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. Could Mr. Bain please be excused?
Yes, thank you.
And Ms. Richards take the next witness.
The next witness is John Mitchell from the Latrobe City Council. Mr. Mitchell?
Please state your full name.
John Leslie Mitchell.
Please raise the Bible and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
to this Board of Inquiry
to this Board of Inquiry
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell. Can you please state your full name and your address?
John Leslie Mitchell,
And you are the Acting Chief Executive Officer of the Latrobe City Council.
I am.
You've had a long history in local government in the Latrobe Valley, broadly. You've been a long-term resident of Traralgon, and for about 12 years you were Chief Executive Officer of the Shire of Traralgon.
The
City of
Traralgon,
Traralgon,
yeah.
excuse me. And you then spent some time as Acting CEO of Baw Shire Council. You were the CEO on a more permanent basis of the Latrobe City Council from 1995 through to 1997.
That's correct.
And then you had some time, again, about 12 years as the Managing Director of Gippsland Water.
That's correct.
So it's probably fair to say you know the region thoroughly.
Well, I know it fairly well.
Yes. You had a period from 2008 running your own consultancy.
I have.
And you were recalled to duty at the end of last year, asked to step up as the acting CEO of Latrobe City Council. And since then you've been living in interesting times.
Yes, it has been interesting times.
I should take you to the statement that you've made. You've provided a statement to the inquiry, which you made some corrections to yesterday, and I understand that a revised version has been circulated to the parties in the course of this morning. Having done that, do you have any further corrections to make to your statement?
No, I do not.
It's a statement of 117 paragraphs and 11 attachments. Is your statement true and correct?
Yes, it is.
I tender that, Your Honour.
Sorry.
I'd like to go straight to the question of children's services operated by the council, and you deal with this starting at page 3 of your statement under the heading items 2 and 3.
Yes.
In paragraph 16 you tell us that there are 24 preschools, 3 early learning centres and 9 maternal and child health centres across the council municipality. Now, of course, that takes in more than Morwell, does it not?
It does. Yeah.
How many preschools, early learning centres and maternal and child health centres are there in Morwell?
There's 4.
4 altogether? So,
There's 4 altogether, yes, and we've got an early childhood centre, which is a combined facility with the Carina.
all right. So there's one
Preschool.
maternal and child health centre here in Morwell.
Yes,
There is the Maryvale Early Learning Centre.
yes,
And then there are 2 preschools, one of which is Carina, which
That's
also provides childcare for children below kindergarten age,
Yes.
so babies and toddlers. You tell us in paragraph 17 that on the evening of the 9th, a decision was made to close all of those services across the municipality on the 10th of February.
That's correct.
And that was largely because of difficulties in simply the staff getting to them in view of the fires that had been burning on the 9th.
That's correct.
I'd like to deal separately with Maryvale Early Learning Centre, mainly because of its location in such close proximity to the mine. I'd like to deal with that before we come to the other facilities. Did Maryvale Early Learning Centre reopen at any stage after the 9th of February?
No, it did not.
No. So the first time it reopened was after the fire had been declared safe?
That's correct.
It's particularly important to identify that because there were levels of benzene detected at the Early Learning Centre in late February. But just to be clear, there were not at any stage children attending that centre after the fire started to burn.
That's correct, yeah.
All right. Now, can you outline the council's decision-making process in relation to the Maryvale Early Learning Centre?
Well, the Maryvale Centre is, of course, located very close to the Morwell mine. Like it's within probably 400 or 500 metres. And
we could just get the map up and ask you to point that out. All right. And there we see directly below it, it's marked open cut coal mine.
That's correct.
With the freeway in between. Are you able to enlighten the board as to why it is that an early learning centre is located so close, not only to an open cut mine but also a freeway?
No, look, I have no knowledge about why the location was made there in terms of that area, but that particular preschool does service the southern area of the Morwell township. So, the location, I guess, in terms of catchment area would have been one of the criteria used, but why that specific site, I cannot answer that.
All right. Well, in any event, the council was conscious that it was very close to the mine and to the fire. Can you talk us through the decision-making process at council in relation to the Maryvale Crescent Early Learning Centre?
Well, because it was in an area that was, very immediately impacted by the smoke and the particulate area, our director of the preschool area took a view that it was just completely untenable to have children and staff within that centre. So, and I guess one of the principles which drove other decisions too about the subsequent closure of other preschools or relocation was the fact that there was the question of the quality of education or program. There was a question about the children having to be restless indoors, and the impacts on staff and also respite for the children. But certainly our director in terms of the Maryvale area said it just wasn't tenable to have that service conducted from that facility.
And that call was made on the 10th of February, if I understood that correctly?
The decision was made on the evening before, on the 9th, but as you said before, it was closed from the 10th and it did not reopen.
All right. And did is it Director of Children's Services, is that the title?
Yes.
Did she or he feel the need to have access to air quality monitoring data or other more specific information before making that decision?
No, I think the decision was made just on the visual impact, and it was like we've had evidence previous to the inquiry to indicate the levels of smoke and concerns about particulate and being so close to the mine, you could see visually, the impact from the fallout. So I think our director made a very good decision and one that was supported and to my knowledge was never ever questioned.
The centre was able to be relocated, or alternative premises were found, but that took some little time, did it not?
Yes, it did.
Yes.
The early childhood component of that was located. I'm sorry, no, that was located to Moe Place. The subsequent service.
All right. So there are two parts to the service. Is that correct? The kindergarten and the early learning.
At Merivale, there was only the preschool area.
All right.
Carinya had the early
the
childhood
two parts. Forgive me.
part.
All right. So that was relocated to Moe Place in Moe from the 24th of February.
That's correct.
So the service didn't operate at all for 2 weeks, and then from the 24th of February operated from an alternate location.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, the other children's services did reopen on the 11th of February. Both Carinya and the other kindergarten,
Yes.
and also the Maternal and Child Health Centre.
That's right.
What decisions were made in relation to those services as the fire continued?
Well, as the fire continued, as I said before, they were actually on resumption. The services were actually conducted with a indoor program, and I think as the event went on and it became evident that we were going to have sustained smoke and I guess adverse conditions, the decision was made that we should actually transfer those services to other facilities.
Now, again, we might ask you to show us on the map where those other facilities are.
We've got the Elizabeth Wilmot preschool up in this area. We've got the Parklands preschool over in this area, and we've got the there's another one there of Carinya, which is down in this area here. So we've got basically a pattern like that.
All right. Now, the Elizabeth Wilmot Centre, if I've got that name right, that's the Maternal and Child Health Centre?
No, the Carinya is the early learning centre and preschool.
Mm-hmm.
So that one's in here.
All right. Now, which of the three locations that you pointed to is the Maternal and Child Health Centre?
The first three. We've got preschool. The maternal child centres are over in this area. We've got one in here. That's just the more maternal and
Yes.
child care.
So children aren't cared for there. It's somewhere where parents,
That's right.
more particularly mothers,
That's right.
take, as particularly newborn babies. All right. So the children's services operated for a time with an indoor program.
Yes.
And then during the third week of the fire on the 26th of February, Ms Pitkin, who's the Director of Child and Family Services, decided that those services should close.
Yes.
What were her reasons for making that decision?
Well, I've already indicated that there was a question about the quality of the program. The fact that the children were running indoor programs, they were getting very restless, and so she wanted to, she had, again, the quality of the program meant that we really had to get a facility where they weren't indoors all the time. I think the question of staff was also an issue, that managing children indoors all day was a challenge for the staff, and then there was also the other principle about respite for both children and our teachers.
And were alternative arrangements made for children who were attending those centres?
Yes, there were. When you say alternative, after we made the closure,
Yes.
the services were transferred.
Yes.
So we had the situation where Elizabeth Wilmot was transferred to Churchill.
Mm-hmm.
We had the Parklands preschool that was transferred to Moe Place. With the Carinya Early Learning Centre, that component of it was transferred to the Traralgon Early Learning Centre. And we had the preschool part transferred to Moe Place, and then similarly with Merivale, we had said that was in Moe Place from the start.
All right. Now, the Chief Health Officer lifted her advice that that vulnerable people should relocate out of the southern part of Morwell on the 17th of March. How soon after that did normal operations resume at all of the children's services in Morwell?
I think, I'm just trying to pick that up, the date. I think, I'm not sure, I'm just trying to pick it up from my statement. Can you help me?
Paragraph 39, I believe.
39.
On the top of page 7.
Ah, yes. On the 24th of March. So that all preschool, early learning centres and maternal and child health centres in Morwell resumed those normal operations.
All right. Now, in the course of that discussion, I've referred to the advice of the Chief Health Officer to that people in vulnerable groups, which included preschool-aged children, should temporarily relocate out of the southern part of Morwell. During her evidence yesterday, Dr Lester referred to a discussion with the council on the 28th of February where an appropriate dividing line was discussed for her advice. Were you aware of that discussion?
I was present at it.
Who else was present?
There was the Victoria Fire Commissioner, Mr Craig Lapsley. There was the Chief Commissioner of Police, Ken Lay. There was Dr Rosemary Lester. There was John Merritt from the EPA and various other departmental representatives. And the council was represented by our Mayor, Councillor Sharon Gibson, myself and Emma Lewis, part of our communications team.
Right, and did that meeting take place here in Morwell?
It did take place in Morwell, yes.
And was the meeting to discuss the advice that Dr Lester was about to give, that vulnerable groups should consider temporary relocation?
Yes, it was.
Yes. Was that meeting minuted or recorded in any way?
I'm not aware that it was minuted, and I can't say if it was recorded.
No. One of the issues discussed was the dividing line. Can you tell us about that discussion?
Well, at the meeting, there was a map which had been plotted in terms of particular readings, and that map was discussed together with the fact that it was the catalyst, those readings, for the voluntary relocation order for vulnerable people. So the question was, what did the data and the plotting on the map tell the group, and what aspects were to be considered in terms of security for people if they did relocate, and how would that be communicated, and what area was going to be defined.
All right. And did you keep a copy of that map?
No, we were never provided with a copy. There was a working map, I'd describe it as.
All right. And which of the various agencies represented had created that map?
Look, I'm not aware. My assumption would be that it was EPA data, so the plotting would have been undertaken by EPA staff. But again, that's my assumption.
All right. I would ask representatives for the state if that map can be located, and I would assume that the EPA is the first place to start, that it be provided to the board.
We'll make some plans.
If we can have the map of Morwell back on the screen and ask you to indicate, as best you can recall, what... so the plotting indicated where particulate levels above a certain level had been recorded. Is that
Well,
correct?
Well, clearly there was a very strong pattern within this area, and there was another little bit of a bubble in terms of the McDonald Road area.
All right. Now, the import of Dr. Lester's evidence yesterday was that the appropriateness of Commercial Road as a dividing line had been discussed with the council, and the council had agreed that it was an appropriate dividing line. Is that an accurate representation of the discussion?
Well, I would describe it as the council was involved in the consultation, but we were not the decision maker. The information was really about, was essentially, I guess the main participants in the conversation were the police, Mr. Lapsley, Dr. Lester, and the EPA, and it was discussion around, it was Dr. Lester's call as the Chief Medical Officer to actually make the decision about the voluntary relocation order.
Now, you indicated that there was an area north of the railway line extending up McDonald Road where there were recordings of particulate matter plotted. Did anybody raise a concern about that area not being in the area where relocation would be recommended?
Well, both Emma Lewis and I did ask the question that how if there was readings along part of McDonald Road, there wasn't a very long section of McDonald Road, then perhaps we should consider the issue of relocation advice within that area. But one of the complications, I guess, was how do you actually provide a clear boundary, for people in terms of the advisory orders, and I can't recall, if you like, the density of plotting within that little bit of a bubble.
If I may, could I just clarify? Do you know what was being plotted on that map?
It was the particulate PM 2.5.
And do you know whether it was on an 8-hour average?
Well, I think. No, I don't. But the question of the reading plus duration was a conundrum, I think, right through this event.
Apart from the difficulty in defining the area within which to which the recommendation would relate, were there any other concerns about extending the recommendation to those living and working north of the railway line?
I don't know. There was a lot of conversation about those working north of the railway line because the plot clearly, I think, was showing that cluster, if you like, south of the railway line. It was only a little bit of a bubble in the more residential area and then I think there's a couple of mixed-use zones in there that in the McDonald bit that I was talking to. So from my memory, there wasn't a lot of conversation regarding people working north of the railway line.
What about people living north of the railway line?
Well, again, the data suggested that the threshold, which the Medical Officer of Health was going to use, that threshold had not been reached for the residential areas north of the line.
You mentioned security concerns earlier. Who raised those concerns in the meeting?
Well, that was a matter which was discussed by the police, essentially, because they realised that if people were going to relocate from their homes, there would have to be increased security within that area, and that was something which I guess was uppermost with the fire, not only in residential terms but also around the fire perimeter.
All right, so there was a concern that the area be readily identified so that it could be patrolled by police?
Yes.
Was that a reason for not including that area to the north of Commercial Road in the recommendation?
Well, my opinion is that it was one of the factors which led to if you like, having a nice, clean, defined area.
Thank you.
Just ask Mr. Mitchell, thank you very much for your statement. Were there discussions about which vulnerable groups should be included in the relocation?
Absolutely. So it was people over the age of 65, people with respiratory issues, pregnant ladies, and young people.
And school-age children?
Well, I think they had young. I can't precisely understand which, or I can't recall in terms of the actual age threshold, but certainly young children were mentioned. Yeah.
In addition to the map that I've asked that the state provide, if it can be found, if there are any minutes or notes of that meeting, I would also ask that they be produced to the board. The next area I'd like to ask you about are the challenges that the council itself faced. We know that your offices are on Commercial Road, possibly provided something of a break, a wind break or a smoke break where they are. But what were working conditions like in the council offices?
Well, look, they were very challenging.
Yes.
And
from what stage? From the first week?
Well, they were challenging from the very next day work opened. Like the fire really got started on the 9th, and from the 10th, you know, there were challenging conditions within the office. And I guess we were conscious, and I was conscious of our obligations in terms of health and safety, and I was also conscious of the need for the council to actually provide a service to the community, and at the same time continue the business as usual functions of council as well.
Yes. Were you conscious of the message it would send to the community if the council were to relocate its operations?
I was particularly conscious of that, and I think that's already perhaps been alluded to earlier this afternoon.
Yes. So you had some competing considerations there, your obligations to your own staff to provide them with a safe workplace, and your obligation to the community. How did you balance those considerations?
Well, I'd like to think the record would show well, but we certainly from early in the week there were certain work groups who were able to relocate and or work from home. But as the days progressed and we started to think about what does our business continuity plan actually tell us and guide us, it was then I actually engaged Professor Arnold Dix to come in and help us with some of that decision making and provide advice to us.
And he provided you with some practical suggestions, did he not?
Yes, he did. Arnold is actually a specialist in terms of managing special risks associated with life, property and environment, and he's a gentleman I've had a fair bit of exposure to before, and I think he helped us normalise, if you like, some of the issues going on around us. And so, for example, Arnold recommended that we actually have widespread use of purifiers to actually remove improve air quality by removing particulate, and so he recommended that we should look at air purifiers, and he did a bit of a research to help determine what type of purifier we should be having. And of course, not only would it remove particulate, but it would also reduce the smoke nuisance and smell within the facilities.
And you sourced a number of those, used them in the council offices. Did they alleviate the smell and the smoke in the offices?
Well, they certainly improved the amenity a lot,
yes.
Absolutely. And so we had two big units within the council offices, and we had one in the library. And we also, as a result of Professor Dix's recommendation, there were something like 30 smaller ones purchased, which were paid for by the state government, and they were made available on loan to people who, I guess you'd described as vulnerable or having a particular respiratory illness. So we have a register of those, and I think essentially now they've largely been returned to the officers.
Were they well used?
Well, they were certainly, I think we had 26 in all put out in terms of the community, but certainly they did their job in terms of the public facilities the council had, and as I said, they vastly improved the amenity, if you like, of the building and the working environment.
You tell us in paragraph 56 that you arranged for Dr Lester and Mr Merritt to address staff members about occupational health and safety matters on the 24th of February, the Monday.
That's right.
And that as a result of that briefing, you arranged for further work sites to be made available for council staff, particularly those who fell into vulnerable groups,
yes,
who might be pregnant or had a pre-existing respiratory condition. At what time did you relocate those vulnerable staff out of the commercial road office?
Well, I think that took the various managers made decisions in consultation with the staff in terms of how they could relocate. Mm-hmm. Like there were clearly women who were they told us they were pregnant or obviously pregnant, and there were those who we didn't know were pregnant. But all of those decisions were made by consultation with their immediate manager and the staff. But I guess the major reasons for providing both John Merritt and Dr Lester available to the staff was to, again, provide expert advice and so that the staff could be as well informed as possible.
Was it a meeting for all staff or management staff?
It was a meeting for all those within the civic centre there in Morwell. Yes, so they were the ones in I guess the area which had which were enduring the smoke and conditions very directly.
Just to be clear, was your decision to make alternative work sites available for those who were particularly vulnerable to the smoke made before or after the 28th of February?
Some staff had relocated immediately after the fire.
Yes.
And the issue was that we then had a discussion about how those decisions were made, again having regard to our business continuity plan. So there were some staff already working remotely, and then there were other decisions made where we rotated staff as well to actually provide respite to them.
I just understood that the 24th of February briefing was a turning point or a critical point after which you then took steps to ensure that further work sites were available. Have I misunderstood that?
No, it was... just to be clear, we'd already made decisions about some staff
yes.
and people relocating, but this one was about, based on the advice now, we wanted to make sure that those who hadn't or who should relocate, we actually would provide that opportunity, and to also rotate staff to provide respite.
All right,
So
that was advice from Dr Lester and Mr Merritt on the 24th of February, is that correct?
No, the decision about rotating staff and that was ours. What I got Dr Lester and Mr Merritt to provide was just an update about what the data's telling us, what you can do, what does it mean. So, and it was after that the management said, well, okay, we will ensure that we rotate or relocate those staff who should be relocated or rotated.
I see we've reached 4:30. I'm going to be, I would estimate, another 15 minutes with Mr Mitchell.
We know he just... idea of what the program's like tomorrow and whether we are better to stop now and continue on normal hours or just keep going. And then you have a better idea of it.
We have some questions
yes.
For this witness, if the board pleases, and I expect it would be in the vicinity of 15, 20 minutes.
Are you in favour of leaving tomorrow?
Yes, plus we hopefully in the meantime can address some of the concerns of our friends, and it might be suitable if everyone thinks fit to maybe stop now.
We don't have a heavy schedule for tomorrow. We have Mr Hall from the Department of Human Services. We have Mr Harkins, who's building up his frequent witness points. And we have Karen Andrews, a community witness. Yes, and we know that Mr Mitchell just works up the road, so...
Okay, adjourn now.